The river did not rage. It whispered, like an old man mumbling forgotten names in sleep. The Danube slid past Nicopolis, silver and ancient, the kind of current that carried more than water. It carried memory. It carried judgment. Below, beneath the shadow of the fortress walls, the laughter of young men echoed like a drumbeat, too bright for the hour. They drank deeply. Their cloaks shimmered with embroidery, their cheeks pink with wine and youth. Velvet, steel, perfume, clinging to they were painted with the myths of their fathers, and armored with the foolish belief that glory could be summoned by birthright alone. As the sky burned into a bruised red, a falcon wheeled in silence above the stone towers. They had not seen war, not truly, not like Jean de one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, the other caressing a strand of wooden rosary beads tied just above the buckle. He knew what it meant when an enemy said nothing. Somewhere behind them, the squire boys sharpened swords on whetstones slick with spit. One of them, no older than 12, hummed as he worked, a soft tune from Burgundy Jaunty, light, the kind his older brother had whistled when he left for Kosovo. His brother never came back, and the tune was the only part of him that had roasted boar, spoiled wine, half-eaten fruit left to rot where boots had trampled them. Rats crept near the refuse piles as the sun trident failed to break through the overcast sky. The air hung thick, as though the earth itself had begun to sweat, knew what it meant when birds stopped singing. But the commanders, they had no room for doubt, knew how pride can be harnessed like a horse, turned against its rider. Their mouths smelled of meat and mead, and their ears heard only the music of their own speeches, not the grand bells of cathedrals in France, but a dull bronze toll that sounded like mourning. It clung to everything. Banners, boots, beards. It muffled sound and distorted sight. Torches burned low, their flames hissing in the damp. He whispered the names of his children beneath his breath, not as a prayer, not as a farewell, but as something to steady his breath. And still they gathered, filing into the small chapel carved into the fortress itself, like ants crawling toward a candle. A gesture, almost unconscious, worn into habit by too many marches through godless mud, and too many prayers shouted into silence. Jean's eyes were fixed not on the feast, nor the firelight, but toward the easterward, a horizon shrouded in mist, and something worse, waiting. He stood apart, wrapped in stillness. He had bled beside rivers like this before, had watched men drown in inches of water with mouths too full of mud to scream. The Sultan retreats, they said. He fears the hammer of Christendom. He heard a trap tightening. Jean heard no fear in that silence. The morning broke, with no sun, only the pale grey wash of a cloudy sky, dripping dew onto chainmail and shivering leaves. The chapel bell rang 3 times. They knelt, but their prayers lacked conviction. They were not for mercy. They were for favor, for fortune, for victory, like something owed. No one asked the boy his age. No one asked why he never slept. They simply took the arrows he handed them and moved on. By noon, the smell of the feast had turned sour, and yet, ... still they polished their armor. Still they shouted in jest. Still they played at war, ignorant of what waited across the mist-laced plains. Somewhere in the low hills beyond the river bank, the Ottomans waited in silence, not hiding watching. They knew the hunger of these Western lords. The Sultan did not need to fight them yet. He only needed them to march first. Jean de Carouge stood atop a narrow parapet that night, watching the fog rise like steam from the river's surface. It clung to everything. Banners, boots, beards. It muffled sound and distorted sight. Torches burned low, their flames hissing in the damp. He whispered the names of his children beneath his breath, not as a prayer, not as a farewell, but as something to steady his breath. A horse neighed from the stables, short, panicked. Somewhere, a dog began to howl. A small one, not bred for war, but brought along for company. It would not stop. It howled like it knew something the men refused to believe. Jean turned to go back to his tent. He passed a group of men knights from Burgundy laughing as they counted coins on a wine barrel, betting on who would take the first Ottoman head. One of them looked up, saw Jean's expression, and faltered. "What is it you see out there, de Carouge?" He didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. That night, a drizzle began to fall. It was soft, more mist than rain, but it soaked everything tense: cloaks, parchment maps. The firewood smoked instead of burning. Inside their canvas shelters, commanders argued over maps with curled corners. They spoke in half-truths and full egos. Each sought glory. None understood the ground they stood on. Across the river, the Ottoman scouts marked every movement. They sent no message. They needed none. The Christians would come. They always did. Loud, glorious, blind, dot. And so the night deepened. The mist grew thicker. The arrows waited in their quivers. The mistake had not yet been made, but it was coming etched into the silence, written between the lines of every ignored warning. It would not come in a roar. It would come in a decision, a step, a charge. And once loosed, it could not be called back. As the moon slipped behind the clouds, Jean lay awake in his cot. The canvas above him flapped with the wind, like a broken wing. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Only the echo of distant drums, the ones no one else seemed to hear yet. And in that rhythm, in that low, steady thrum of fate, he knew this would be no crusade. This would be a graveyard, and they were walking toward it with polished boots and silver goblets, blind to the shadow gathering just beyond the veil. Tomorrow, he thought, they will cross that field. Tomorrow, the silence will end. But for now, the fog remained, thick, cold, waiting. The banner of France sagged in the drizzle. Its golden fleur-de-lis, once proud against the blue, had faded into pale, ghostly shapes blurred by rain, worn by time, and heavy with the weight of what was coming. Along the wooden ramparts of Nicopolis, the sounds were muffled. The dull knock of boots against wet planks, the creak of a canopy drawn taut with ropes stained red from old battles, the low murmur of men who should have spoken more carefully. Beneath that shelter of dyed sailcloth stood the leaders of the Christian host, draped in velvet, mail and arrogance. The Hungarian king Sigismund held his posture like a statue chipped by weather. His crown gleamed despite the rain, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the east. He had seen too much to trust quiet ground. Around him gathered the French nobles, young, bold, brilliant in armor that had not yet been bloodied. Their laughter had grown quieter, but their pride had not. They stood close, shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with perfumes, damp wool, and the smoke of wet torches that sputtered in the breeze. Behind them, the town of Nicopolis breathed its uneasy rhythms. Chickens scuttled across cobblestones, slick with grease and blood. Children scattered seed beneath gallows that still bore the creaking burden of Ottoman captives. Soldiers too poor for mail now shivered in linen soaked through with river sweat and fever. In the small infirmary near the fortress gates, nuns whispered over men who no longer opened their eyes, some gone to plague, others to wounds that festered beneath broken plate and shattered faith. One nun clutched a crucifix in silence as flies buzzed above a soldier's brow. His mouth had been sewn shut the night before, but no one would say why. The crusade, promised in thunder and scripture, had arrived in the form of mud. Boiled river fish filled their bowls, bony, flavorless and steaming, just enough to fog the breath of the men who ate it in silence. Bread was rationed, thick with barley husk and ground acorn. Wine had turned sour, and still the priests murmured blessings over it. In the high courtyard, Philippe d'Artois, Constable of France, adjusted his cloak as two Ottoman envoys arrived under banners of white. Their horses were lean, their faces unreadable beneath layers of dust and decorum. They bowed low, their hands open, their words measured with the cadence of those who knew what waited if they were refused. They brought gold, they brought terms, they promised retreat, safe passage, withdrawal, a way out without shame. But the French nobles did not hear the sincerity in those words. They only heard insult, cowardice, weakness. They scoffed, their laughter echoing across the damp square, like the crack of dry timber underfoot. They remembered Poitiers, they remembered Tours, they remembered crusades wreathed in fire and song. But what they remembered was a myth. They did not remember how the wind bites when morale breaks. They did not remember what the mud smells like when it is churned by dying men. Balkan scouts stood nearby, unspeaking. Their faces were thin, lined with the knowledge of earlier campaigns. Their eyes screamed warnings, warnings no one would heed. The peasants had begun to disappear, the ones who cooked, cleaned, and buried the dead. The ones who remembered the names of the old valleys. They left in the night, their belts drawn tight, their oxen yoked without lanterns. No one stopped them. No one noticed, except perhaps the dogs, who whined louder now and barked at nothing. A woman watched from a shuttered window. Her hands gripped the wood like it might splinter beneath her fingers. Her Her veil, soaked from the wind-driven rain, stuck to her face. Her son had joined the Burgundians a week before, barely 16, pale and proud. He believed that steel could save souls, that banners could make a man holy. She did not believe. She prayed not for his triumph, but for wheat, that one day the soil might hold something other than bodies, that children might dig for carrots, not bones, that silence might return to the fields in peace, not in mourning. Inside the tent, the Ottoman offer was rejected, not with words, but with boots. One of the French commanders spat on the parchment. Another stepped on the gold token offered by the Sultan's men, grinding it into the mud. The envoys said nothing. They only bowed again, lower, this time, and turned. When they left, the clouds gathered lower, thicker. The light dimmed, though it was only midday then. A sound, deep, subtle, but unmistakable. It was not thunder from the sky. It was a rumble from the earth, a kind of groan, as if the land itself recoiled at the arrogance of men. Philippe d'Artois turned, suddenly uneasy. His fingers twitched toward the hilt of his sword, not from fear, but from instinct. Some ancestral shiver in the spine, but he said nothing. No one did. The nobles returned to their planning, their boasting, their maps that showed mountains where none stood, their songs of Jerusalem, sung beneath a grey Balkan sky. Later that night, the horses screamed. One had broken free, tearing through the lines with wild eyes and foam at the mouth. It took 3 men to restrain it, and still, it kicked like it saw death coming through the trees. A priest in the lower quarter dropped his censer. The coals scattered over the stones, hissing in the wet. Some said it was the wind, others said it was nothing. But above it all, the banner of France still hung, sodden, heavy, its gold dimmed to a pale, dripping yellow, like a relic washed many times, like a ghost sewn into silk. The fatal hour had not yet struck, but its shadow had begun to stretch, slow, inevitable, like a tide rising beneath the floorboards of a house already crumbling. And across the river, the drums began, not loud, not fast, just a single, steady beat, the kind you feel in the chest before you hear it with the ear. The Christian lords turned their eyes toward the east again, but by then it was already too late. What they had rejected was not peace. It was their last chance to remain in the world of the living. The scent of morning should have been soft dew on grass, pine smoke curling from hearths, bread rising in warm ovens. But at Nicopolis, the first breath of day came laced with burnt hemp, a rope, charred in the night, sabotaged from a siege engine, left half collapsed like a wounded animal in the mud. The air hung thick, not with storm or smoke, but with something harder to name. Dread, tension, a pressure that pressed against the skin, heavy as soaked wool. Horses stamped nervously in their lines, their ears twitching, flanks damp with restless sweat. Men stirred from their tents, slowly, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, mouths tight with things unspoken. On the high ridge overlooking the Danube, a ribbon of smoke curled in lazy spirals from a line of Ottoman watchfires. Small, distant, and yet utterly precise. They were not for warmth. They were not for cooking. They were for speaking a quiet tongue of heat and ash, sending signals through the dark to men hidden in forests and hills. Warnings, readiness, perhaps even mockery. The Christians saw them but understood nothing. Inside his command tent, King Sigismund of Hungary leaned over a spread of parchment. Maps, some drawn by court cartographers in careful ink, others scrawled by exhausted scouts on damp vellums, streaked with grease and blood. Goblets weighted the corners. One had tipped and spilled wine gone sour across a list of noble names. His advisors bickered in the background, about alliances, about precedents, about who would lead the charge. But Sigismund no longer listened. His eyes remained fixed on the crude drawing from a Wallachian courier, aerovines, shaped like jaws. Forest roots knotted with hidden paths, strange symbols drawn with fingers that trembled. The enemy is not where you look, the boy had said before collapsing in the mud. The Ottoman army moved like vapor, appearing, dissolving, reforming in new shapes, and Sigismund's own host. They argued over banners. A crusade without unity was not a sword. It was shattered glass, waiting for the bare feet of the innocent. Outside, the rituals of denial continued. A French knight knelt beside his shining breastplate, buffing it to a mirror's sheen. The mud of Nicopolis had not yet claimed it, and he imagined it never would. His squire crouched nearby, tying his master's tunic with trembling fingers. The boy's skin was pale, smudged with dirt and fear. He had not slept in 2 nights, not since he had seen the body. It had hung from a poplar tree beside the northern road, flayed, mutilated, left swaying like a banner. A wooden sign nailed to its ribs bore characters the boy could not read, but he understood enough. This was not war, it was a message, and it had been received. The falcon cried, high above the camp. It sliced the grey sky in a single arc, diving with sudden violence. Toward the riverbank, it scattered a flock of doves that had roosted in the broken rafters of a ruined tower. One bird fell struck mid-flight, lifeless in the grass. A stable hand saw it all. He said nothing, just picked up the limp body and buried it behind the latrines. A small grave, a quiet omen, a secret. Within the camp, the noise grew. Arguments turned to shouting. The younger French commanders, bold-coiffed, impatient, pressed forward with demands. They would take the vanguard. They would lead the charge. They would shatter the Turk like kindling. They spoke of honor, of St. George, of banners flying. In the eastern sun. Sigismund objected, quietly, then firmly. Wait, he said. Let them come to us. Let the terrain work for us, not against. But they laughed, not cruelly, dismissively, as if he were a tired uncle at a feast, worrying over ghosts while the table overflowed with wine. They did not see what he saw, could not feel what he felt. In the shifting wind, in the way the enemy had not yet revealed its size, their pride was not poison, it was perfume, and it had dulled their senses beyond recall. At dusk, the final council was called, a wide table, candles flickering in damp holders, parchments unfurled like funeral shrouds. Maps pointed to rivers, not ambushes, hills, not killing fields. Sigismund made his plea one last time. His voice was low, weighted. He asked not for obedience, but for patience. The French commanders did not argue. They simply folded the maps, smiled, tapped the hilts of their swords and bowed. The decision was made. The Christian host would advance. Their cavalry would ride first. The nobles would lead, and history merciless and watchful took one slow step forward. Later, in the flickering light of his tent, Sigismund sat alone. The parchment still smelled of beeswax and ink. His wine remained untouched. Outside, a dog barked once, then silence. The fires on the ridge had vanished. The smoke had thinned 2 threads, but still he felt it. A presence gathering beyond the trees. Not sound, not shape, a gravity, as if the world itself leaned toward something terrible. He took a piece of chalk and drew a crude cross on the tent pole, not for superstition, for surrender. He knew what they had done. They had not sent their bravest men into battle. They had offered them as sacrifice, to pride, to vanity, to history. And across the darkening valley, the Ottomans waited, not with rage, not with fear, but with order, perfect, patient, unforgiving. Tomorrow, the banners would rise. Tomorrow, the horns would sound. But tonight, the decision had been made. The first wound had already been struck, and it bled in silence. A solitary bell rang. Its tone cut through the thick dawn like a knell for the living, not the dead. Not yet. It tolled not in mourning, but in warning, long and low, like a voice gone hoarse with grief. Yet no one listened. No one truly heard. The Crusader camp stirred to life with the sluggish arrogance of men who believed themselves chosen. Victory was not a question. It was a garment already worn. Silks from Venice fluttered beside swords blackened by Balkan dust. Soldiers paraded in cloaks dyed deep crimson, with prayer ribbons tied to their wrists, gifts from Avignon priests who had never seen a battlefield. Their mouths whispered piety. Their eyes gleamed with hunger. This was not a campaign. It was a parade. It was theater. It was prophecy. But the wind disagreed. It had shifted some time in the night, quietly as winds do. It brought with it no song, only the whisper of rot-distant fire and something fouler, a sweetness in the wrong key, a smell that clung to fingernails, and the creases of armor, the perfume of decay, the scent of old death, long buried, unearthed by fate. Nicopolis glimmered behind them. The city was quiet, cloaked in early morning haze. Its towers once proud stood like watchers with their faces turned away, as if even stone could feel shame for what approached. As if the city itself refused to witness what would soon unfold. Along the road, the illusion thinned. Carpenters cursed as they hammered U-boards onto broken wagons. salvaged wood repurposed into promises that wouldn't last the journey. Monks stumbled barefoot through mud, their palms blistered and red, not from writing scripture, from binding wounds, from lifting bodies. Their Latin was fractured. Their faith, to this, was not a holy march. This was not a procession of light. This was a walk into forgetting. Bayezid's army remained invisible, but presence does not require sight. Their hands were everywhere, in broken timbers, in stolen horses, in the silence that followed each sudden gust of wind through the trees. Birds went quiet too often. Paths that once bustled with peasants now lay abandoned, haunted by wind and memory. The trap was not sprung, it was already closed, and yet the songs continued. Knights toasted over campfires, their goblets high, their oaths louder than their doubts. They argued about glory, whose banner would crest the hill first, who would carve their names into the bones of Ottoman command. Even now, even here, they dreamed in marble and myth. Among them walked a man from Brabant, a simple foot soldier, quiet, watchful, often overlooked. In his pouch, wrapped in a strip of linen, he carried a broken pendant, a chipped bit of painted bone, a relic, he'd told his friends, kissed for protection by the Bishop of Liege. But it was a lie. The relic was fake, bought from a toothless peddler years ago in a market that no longer existed. He told no one, but each night, as the fires dimmed and the sky opened above him, he reached for it, touched it gently, as if belief might be borrowed, for a few hours, as if faith, true or false, might still be heard in the dark. That night, the storm arrived. Thunder broke over the Danube like God pounding on a sealed door. Lightning split the clouds into bleeding wounds, bright, jagged, brilliant. In those flashes, the world became an X-ray of its own doom. In one flash, a banner was torn from its pole. The silk snapped, caught in a gust, and was flung into the black river like a dying bird. It floated there, slowly, trailing its threads behind it. No one retrieved it, not because they didn't see, but because they didn't dare. The storm howled. Horses screamed in their hobbles, bucking against the wind. Men cursed as tents collapsed. One knight shouted for his squire, and received only the wet slap of mud in his mouth. And yet, through it all, the nobles prepared. Inside a half-flooded tent lit by flickering lanterns. They donned cloaks stitched with golden lions, eagles, fleurs. Their furs were fox and sable. Their fingers glittered with rings. One polished the horn of his saddle. Another sharpened a blade, already honed to perfection. They believed, even now, especially now, that the storm was a test, that God would clear the skies, that their names would echo through centuries, carried on the songs of bards and scribes. They had no reason to believe this, but belief does not require reason, it only requires need. Somewhere in the darkness, a monk dropped his crucifix. It sank into the mud with a soft plop. He did not pick it up. He simply turned, muttering a prayer that even he did not understand. Elsewhere, the man from Brabant sat beneath a tilted cart. Rain ran down his collar. He held the pendant in his fist and whispered his wife's name just once, then tucked it away unseen. The bell had long since stopped ringing, but its echo lingered, not in the air, in the bones, in the river. Something moved slick and heavy, drifting just beneath the surface, and Nicopolis remained still, watching, waiting. Waiting, veiled in haze, as the first trumpet was raised to a nobleman's lips, as the orders were barked in 5 languages, and none, as boots sank into the churned, bleeding earth. One final gust of wind passed over the Crusader host. It smelled of salt, and fire, and something older, like the breath of history, held, and finally exhaled. The firelight trembled, asterisk across the wide, wet plain. Campfires flickered like dying stars. Their glow pressed tight against the vast, suffocating wall of darkness that clung to the earth like grief. No wind, no sky, just cold breath, and an air too still for comfort. Not yet dawn, not yet judgment. Only the hour when soldiers question whether they will ever see light again. And still they moved. The Crusaders crept through the murk like phantoms, muffled and slow. Greaves were strapped with fingers numbed from the rain. Bowstrings were pulled, taut, checked twice, then once more. Arrows were kissed, muttered over, slid into quivers. Prayers slipped from cracked lips, half Latin. No lutes sang now, no jesters remained. The music had ended in the storm. Joy had been packed away alongside the silk banners and wine flasks. This was no longer a march. It was a funeral procession that hadn't yet begun. Only metal answered. Metal now sharpening, testing, clinking like dull church bells in a forsaken abbey. A cough echoed in the fog. Then silence reclaimed it. In a corner of the camp, where the firelight didn't reach, a Templar chaplain knelt beside a shallow trench. The earth was loose, uneven, hastily turned. Within it lay the unnamed boys, men, brothers, dead without glory, unblessed but not entirely forgotten. The chaplain whispered psalms, his voice more breath than sound. He dipped his fingers in rainwater, tracing crosses in the air above the bodies. No markers adorned the graves, just stones, and one sprig of rosemary. It had been left by a girl, perhaps 16, disguised in a boy's tunic. She had dug with her bare hands. Her brother, fallen in the last skirmish, had died screaming her name. She buried him in silence. When it was done, she stood, brushed the mud from her sleeves, and rejoined the line. Her eyes burned, but her voice did not falter. Further uphill, under a tent thick with mildew, the nobles argued. They bellowed in French, in Hungarian, in Wallachian. Each tongue fought for space, for control, for righteousness. None listened. All insisted. Maps were stained with wine and rain. Swords pointed not at the enemy, but at each other's chests. Pride made poor strategy, and pride was all they had left. In the doorway stood a scout from Serbia. His horse had collapsed at the camp's edge legs, bloodied lungs, drowning in mud. The scout had ridden through the night. He had seen things in the forest too still, too quiet. Shapes without torches, paths without birdsong. Even the wind had changed. He waited, breath ragged, dust caked beneath his eyes. He tried to speak. They ignored him. He spoke louder, desperate, told them of ridgelines perfect for an ambush, of choke points hidden beneath innocent brambles, of an absence of noise so complete it made his teeth ache. Still, they did not hear. No orders changed, no formations shifted, no hearts opened. A raven landed. It perched atop a buried lance, half sunk in the soaked earth. Its wings trembled once, and it caught a dry, guttural rasp that echoed too far. Then again, and then it took flight. Black against the grey, an omen, or merely a bird. No one marked it, but the land had already spoken. The fields remembered. Rusting arrowheads poked through the mud like teeth. Old blood still painted the undersides of rocks. Iron lay where flesh had once fallen. Nothing in this place was new. Not the war, not the arrogance, not the doom creeping slowly forward like a tide that refused to turn back. And still they would charge. Without coordination, without listening, without unity, they would break. Not because they were weak, but because they could not imagine losing. The fog curled tighter around the camp, blurring banners, muting torches, dulling even the brightest armor to a shadow. Men stood shoulder to shoulder but felt alone. Time thickened. Minutes stretched. Then the trumpet called. Its cry cracked the stillness like a branch breaking beneath too much snow. But the note was warped, dragged sideways by fog, muffled by damp. It sounded less like command and more like warning. A scream, stretched too thin. An old knight crossed himself. He stood alone beside a toppled barrel, his chainmail rusting at the shoulders. His eyes were pale, cloudy with age and memory. He whispered a name, not Christ's, not Mary's, not even his king's, his son's, killed 5 years ago at Kosovo. Another campaign, another lie, another field soaked with young blood. But here he was again, hoping that dying a second time might make the first count for something, somewhere in the woods ahead. The Sultan's janissaries waited. They did not fidget, they did not pray, they did not tremble. They knelt in perfect silence, bows drawn, blades unsheathed, hearts unshaken, trained from childhood, born in conquest, baptized in fire. They were not boys wrapped in velvet. They were memory made flesh, discipline made bone. They waited without breath, and the crusaders marched toward them, like men stepping into their own graves. The fires behind them still flickered, but no warmth followed, only the quiet, that terrible, endless quiet, the kind that comes before splintering, the kind that always comes before war. The wind dragged dust through the wheat stubble outside Nicopolis, lifting it in spirals that caught the early sun like gold shavings. The city behind stood proud and blind, its towers intact, its windows shut. Below, rows of tents stretched like scars across the earth, each bearing a different sigil. each housing men who had never fought alongside one another. It was unity written in ink, not blood. A fragile pact, whispered on the wind, destined to shatter against the unforgiving anvil of fate. The very air hummed with a tension that only the naive could ignore, a silent prelude to the storm gathering. On the horizon, the sun, a cold, indifferent eye, cast long shadows that seemed to swallow hope whole. Each gust of wind carried not just dust, but the faint, metallic scent of fear, clinging to the banners that snapped defiantly above the camp. This was a place where destinies converged, where the grand pronouncements of kings would soon collide with the brutal realities of steel and blood. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first tremor of the coming cataclysm. Inside a pavilion stitched with crimson thread, the French nobles dined on roast partridge and honeyed figs, oblivious to the rot creeping in their grain stores. Their laughter, thick with wine and arrogance, echoed off the silken walls, a jarring counterpoint to the silent dread that gripped the common folk. Their boots were cleaned each night, their polished leather reflecting the flickering candlelight, a testament to a comfort they believed was their birthright. Their swords, gleaming and ornate, hung at their sides, more symbols of status than instruments of war. Their ears, deafened by privilege and pride, were closed to the pleas of commoners, who had seen the Sultan's army in motion. One peasant woman, her face etched with the harsh lines of a life lived close to the soil, knelt before the camp gates. In her trembling hands, she clutched a bundle of torn maps, crude but accurate, warning them of ravines filled with sharpened spikes, of hidden paths that would lead them to slaughter. They laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound, tossing her a copper coin as if charity could absolve them of their blindness, and sent her away, back into the shadows from which she had emerged. The scent of their feast, rich and cloying, mingled with the faint, acrid smell of their impending doom. Not far beyond the hills, where the land began to ripple into a desolate, unforgiving expanse, the Ottoman forces drilled in silence. Their movements were fluid, precise, a dance of death honed by years of relentless campaigning. Their armor was not adorned with fanciful crests or gleaming jewels. It was scarred, utilitarian, bearing the marks of countless battles. Their food was simple, sustenance for the body, not indulgence for the palate. Their resolve, a cold, unyielding fire, had been forged in the crucible of sieges, the bitter taste of betrayals, and long marches under burdens that would crush lesser men. Bazid's men did not pray for victory. They prepared to become instruments of it. Each swing of a scimitar, each thud of a boot on the parched earth, was a prayer in itself, a silent vow of unwavering devotion to their sultan and their cause. The air around them was thick with discipline, a stark contrast to the decadent chaos of the Crusader camp. They were a sharpened blade, waiting for the command to cut. A young boy among the Crusaders, his face still soft with the vestiges of childhood, practiced with a dulled blade near the camp's edge. He had lied about his age, his voice cracking with feigned bravado, to fight for Christendom, to earn a glory he could barely comprehend. That morning, a small silver ring, his mother's last tangible link to him, slipped from his pouch, falling silently into the mud. He left it there, believing, with the innocent certainty of youth, that he would return to retrieve it after the battle, a small, forgotten treasure awaiting his triumphant return. He would not be mud, cold and indifferent, swallowed the ring, a tiny, metallic whisper of a life soon to be extinguished. His eyes, wide, with a mixture of fear and naive hope, scanned the horizon, searching for an enemy he had only ever imagined. In the heroic tales of minstrels, a priest, his face pale and drawn, burned incense that choked the chapel tent, the sweet, heavy smoke mingling with the stale air of fear and doubt. He waved a thurible of brass, shaped like a lion's head, its gaping maw exhaling clouds of fragrant despair. Fortitudo, he intoned, his voice a reedy whisper. Strength, but his voice trembled, a fragile reed bending in the wind of his own burgeoning terror. His eyes, darting nervously, betrayed the hollowness of his words, the desperate plea for a divine intervention he no longer truly believed in. The scent of sanctity was overwhelmed by the stench of impending doom. From the distance, a sound began. Drums, low, steady, like a heartbeat, but alien and certain. A rhythm that resonated not with life, but with the inexorable march of death. It was the pulse of an approaching storm, a primal thrum that vibrated through the very ground, through the bones of every man who heard it. And still, the feast went on. The clinking of goblets, the boisterous laughter, a desperate, pathetic, the attempt to drown out the insistent beat of their own destruction. As if defiance, a flimsy shield woven from hubris, could swallow fate whole. The last rays of the setting sun cast a blood-red glow over the camp, painting a grim prophecy on the canvas of the sky. The drums grew louder, a relentless, unyielding crescendo. Each beat a hammer blow against the fragile walls of their self-deception. The night was falling, and with it, the shadow of the silence that followed the last drumbeat was not peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet before the storm breaks, before the world changes forever. The stage was set, the players oblivious, and the curtain was about to rise on a tragedy of epic proportions. The wind, now a mournful sigh, carried the faint echo of a distant, triumphant cry, a sound that would soon become a scream. Twilight had bled across the horizon, leaving the world painted in shades of bruised purple and ochre. The colors clung to the canvas of tents that clustered the Danube's muddy edge like wounds stitched across a battlefield not yet made. Torches flickered in their iron sconces, casting uneven halos over men who had forgotten the shape of comfort. Their feet, soaked and caked with the black muck of the riverbank, shuffled slowly through half-formed routines, checking tack, muttering prayers, blinking the sleep that never quite came. No one moved with purpose, not anymore. The rhythms of the crusade had changed. Somewhere downriver, wolves howled. Not close, not far, just near enough to remind the living that something still hunted in the dark. And not everything wore armor. In a quiet corner, where the camp's chaos faded to soft shadows, Sir Geoffrey de Montferrat sat beneath a trembling lantern. His whetstone whispered against his blade in a dry, rhythmic chant. Stroke after stroke, a hymn to repetition, a prayer for control. His hands were ruined, calloused, cracked, the knuckles swollen like old stones. This was not his first war, not his 10th, yet something in his chest twisted tighter with each passing hour. Not fear, not exactly. Something slower, older, the kind of foreboding that settled behind the eyes and refused to speak its name. Maybe it was the boy, the one who had joined his retinue outside Boudebert 15, too young to shave. He had sworn loudly, insisted, on sleeping with his dagger clutched to his chest like a relic. But each morning, Geoffrey found him behind the latrines, retching bile and regret into the riverbank. The boy had never killed, would never kill. Geoffrey knew that now. Maybe it was the silence behind them. No messages, no reinforcements, no riders from Transylvania or Bohemia. Just roads that stretched empty beneath a leaden sky. The world behind them had gone quiet, and the quiet had weight. Inside the grand pavilion, the torches burned higher. The nobles gathered beneath silken banners damp with mildew, their boots trailing river mud across imported rugs. The tent was full of voices, certain expensive voices. King Sigismund stood near the war map, his finger pressed to the terrain. His voice carried the weariness of a man who had outlived too many kinds of optimism. Let them come to us, he urged. Let them spend their strength first. Wait for the hills to give us sight. He spoke like a man begging, not commanding, but pride sat heavy on gold-threaded shoulders. The French lords would not wait. Their armor gleamed too brightly, their horses too richly fed. They had not crossed Europe to stand still. They would charge, they would lead, they would die, and they would take hundreds with them, brave men, foolish men, men who deserved better than to be lost in another noble's theater. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. The trap was already sprung, not with ropes or pits, but with silence, with patience. Bayezid had studied his enemy the way others studied scripture. He had read their pride, their need for spectacle, their contempt for delay. He had laid the field like a stage, forests thick on either side, the center open and tempting. He would offer retreat, he would offer false panic, and when the night swallowed the bait, the hills would come alive with arrows and thunder. It would not be a battle, it would be a lesson, and history, as ever, would charge into it blind. Outside, Sir Geoffrey stood. The light had faded to blue. He sheathed his sword, not from readiness, but surrender. In the dim firelight, the Crusader host looked like a masquerade of ghosts, figures swathed in borrowed glory, their banners stiff with damp. The laughter had gone. Even the bravest now spoke in low tones, as if their breath might summon something watching from the trees, somewhere near the siege wagons. The boy prayed again, but the words faltered. He had forgotten the Latin. Geoffrey didn't correct him. He sat beside the boy, offering a piece of bread and no wisdom. "I dreamed of fire," the boy whispered. Jeffrey nodded. "Then you're ready." Overhead, clouds gathered thick gray and unmoved by the fires beneath them, but no storm would come from them. Not yet. The storm was already here, and it had no thunder, only choices, and those choices had already been made, one, by stubbornness, by certainty, by the unyielding spine of pride. In the last gasp of light, Sigismund stood alone beside the Danube. The torchlight did not touch him here. He watched the water move like a slow wound, its surface dark and unreadable. He had seen the trap, he had named it, but no crown could silence men whose fathers had died for banners, not reasoned up behind him. The first bugles readied, the horses stamped, the French lords prepared their charge, polishing already shining armor, threading plumes through helms, as if victory were inevitable, as if war were a parade, as if patience had no place in glory. And as the final torch burned down to its base, Sigismund whispered into the wind, not a prayer, not a curse, just a single truth that no one had listened to. This war is already over, and somewhere, just beyond the edge of firelight, the Janissaries waited still, silent, smiling,